Good afternoon to those of you who are joining us live today, and hello to those who will be watching at other times. Welcome to this webinar series titled Reproductive and Economic Justice in a Post-Roe Landscape, Changing the Conversation in Christian Communities. This is the first of 5 webinars, which will all take place in the same time slot, Mondays at 5 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central, from today through October 24th. I'm Jeremy Posadas, and I hold the Marchman Chair of Civic and Social Responsibility at Stetson University in Central Florida. We are right now literally in the calm before the storm, though of course many have already weathered the storm thus far. It is my honor to moderate today's session. These webinars have been designed by a team of scholars and activists who will be moderating various of the respective sessions, all under the auspices of the Wendland Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt Divinity School. The Wendland Cook Program is committed to advancing matters of economic and ecological justice, always with a concern for the intersections of oppressions, including racism and patriarchy. We are investigating how religion can become part of the solution rather than remain part of the problem. And we believe that those who are most affected by the pressures of our age are not just victims, they are also agents of mutual liberation, and they model new forms of solidarity. Other partners and sponsors for this webinar series include In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda, the Central Labor Council of Nashville and Middle Tennessee, Union Theological Seminary in New York City, Drew Theological School at Drew University, and the Carpenter Program in Religion, Gender, and Sexuality, also at Vanderbilt Divinity School. We're so grateful to all of these sponsors and partners for helping make this series possible. I also want to note there is a blog series accompanying these webinars available at the Wendland Cook website, www.religionandjustice.org. Today's webinar is titled Connections, and for it, we have the immense privilege of listening to 2 revered movement leaders whom I will introduce momentarily in conversation with each other. Their conversation will frame the entire series, first by providing an overview of the movements for reproductive justice and economic justice, and then by exploring several zones of shared interest. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll discover new ways these movements can build solidarity with one another and new ways their activists are creatively advancing in the face of fierce opposition, thereby transforming society and religious communities. Before we jump into the conversation, let me explain 2 options for your participation during this live session. And also note that the live session is streaming on Facebook as well, so you can watch us there. Throughout the session, you can post questions using Zoom's Q&A box, and you can also upvote a question that someone else has asked. In the last portion of our time, we will be able to respond to at least some of these questions. We will not be able to get to all of the questions, but we will make an effort to answer those with the most support first. You can also post comments in the chat function, although please be aware that the panelists will likely not be responding to the discussion there. Now, let me introduce our panelists today, who will be joining us momentarily on video as well. Dr. Toni Bond is one of the founding mothers of the Reproductive Justice Framework, a group of 12 Black women who first articulated reproductive justice as a concept. Dr. Bond now continues this work as both an activist and a scholar affiliated with the Claremont School of Theology. Ms. Vonda McDaniel is the president of the Central Labor Council of Nashville and Middle Tennessee, having entered the labor movement from the shop floor of a rubber tire plant. She now also serves on the National Executive Council of the whole AFL-CIO. She trained as an organizer in a United Steelworkers program called Women of Steel, and as will become clear in our conversation, that title, Women of Steel, applies equally well to both of our panelists. Toni and Vonda, I welcome you to join us for our conversation. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm seeing a message, the chat is being reported as maybe it's disabled. So we'll be working on that in the background, but we're going to continue with our conversation to make sure we have lots of time together. So grateful for you both to be here. I've long admired the work you do. It's so crucial, and it's so exciting to bring the two movements you are leaders of in conversation with each other at such a key moment in our country's and our world's struggles for justice. To begin, and to help bring our audience members in, I'm wondering if you could each describe some highlights of your journey. Vonda, you in the labor movement, Toni, you in the reproductive justice or RJ movement. So Vonda, why don't you start? What are some highlights of your journey?
Well, Jeremy, and to the organizers of this event, thank you for inviting me and including the Central Labor Council as a part of this panel. So 30 years, it's been a long journey. I grew up in a social justice church, First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill. And so there I was able to observe from just an observation spot around what organizing looked like, not only in a workplace, that's something that I learned later, but what happens when you organize in the community. And so I took those experiences and linked them with the experiences that I had in the union, which weren't always around what was happening outside of the workplace. Generally, that was around wages, hours, and working conditions, but was able to expand it as my leadership began to expand. To include things in our community around housing, around equitable pay and equitable development in our city. And so there were a lot of things in our workplace that I saw that I wanted to be a part of changing. Health and safety was where I first kind of leaned in terms of some organizing work. The steelworkers have a great rapid response program in addition to the Women of Steel program. And so that's where I kind of developed the organizing chops that would really serve me well in these later years of my career. But it's definitely been a journey full of ups and downs for sure.
Thanks so much, Vonda. Toni, how about you? What are some highlights in your journey in the RJ movement, excuse me.
Sure. So like Vonda, it's been over 30 years for me doing this work. I started out working in the doing more reproductive rights work. My entree into the reproductive health rights movement was as the first woman of color to lead the Chicago Abortion Fund, which is one of the oldest funds in the Midwest. And CAF provided direct financial support for people who were seeking second trimester abortions. So I jumped right in. Talk about jumping right in. And it was while I was at the Chicago Abortion Fund that I got the opportunity to meet the other 11 Black women who coined the term reproductive justice and collectively laid the foundation for the movement. But really, prior to my actual work as an activist, I brought my lived experiences, much like you, Vonda. I brought my lived experience as a Black woman who had survived varying forms of reproductive and sexual oppression, and having direct lived experience with what it meant to live your life at the intersections, and what it meant to both as an individual on the receiving end experience those forms of reproductive punishment that legal scholar and reproductive justice scholar Dorothy Roberts talks about. And then as an advocate, working at the Chicago Abortion Fund, getting a deepened understanding about the various forms of oppression that people had to try and transcend just to obtain a safe abortion. And so that was really my entree into the movement. Certainly being one of the founding, the 12 Black women who helped to found the RJ movement has been, I think, one of my greatest highlights. I often say, well, if I don't do anything else, maybe I've done enough, but there's still more work to do. And to see the theory and framework blossom, though we coined the term and laid the foundation for the movement, it was other women of color who came and further expounded upon the theory that we had developed. The interesting thing about reproductive justice is that the work came before the theory. So, talk about where theory and praxis intersect. We did the work before we even put ideas about the theory on paper. And so it really was a labor of bringing in the lived experiences of the individuals that we were all in contact with, that we all had the honor to do advocacy work on the behalf, alongside of, and being able to connect those lived experiences to what it meant to be individuals living in bodies that are continuously denied access to reproductive and sexual health care, sometimes in our communities, by local, state, or federal government, and by other private actors. So a lot of highlights, but certainly the biggest is being a part of the startup and watching it grow over the past years.
Yeah, I want to just highlight something, Toni, you pointed to as a common thread, is that both of you have been deeply involved in movement leadership, but always grounded in the real lives of the communities you're part of, the real lives of women in general, women of color in general, and specifically Black women who are fighting for justice. And that's just such an important, as best I know, both of you, you've never lost that grounding in what are the real experiences right now of Black women, women of color, women in general, the whole communities that people are embedded in that are struggling. And that's always been, to my mind, part of your strong witness for both of you, is that groundedness.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's an important part of, as I'm sure probably for the her story of your work, Vonda, but it certainly is an important part of the her story for the reproductive justice movement, because it's those lived experiences that give us the foundation about how we need to approach the work, how we need to do the work. And it also highlights that reproductive justice, the theory, is not subjugated knowledge. In fact, it comes from the grassroots. And while it has been certainly made its way into various academies, reproductive justice at the very heart, its very nature, is about the lived experiences of individuals to transcend varying forms of reproductive and sexual oppression.
And Vonda, I'm also, oh, go ahead, Vonda, yeah.
So I would say, respond to Toni, the lived experiences is something that we can't help but bring into the work. I mean, we live in our communities and we go home to the challenges that we see and try to address those within the scope of our work. I would say that I'm a bit envious of Toni, because she was able to meet these 11 outstanding women. I didn't have that luxury. I really kind of had to seek out, examples of women doing the kind of work that I was interested in, and finding those best practices and incorporating them into the work that we were doing here.
Although one thing, I say this only from some background, obviously, Toni, you're the expert on what I'm about to bring up, but both the RJ movement and women of color leaders in the labor movement have had to really establish a place where your perspectives are respected and honored relative to, on the RJ side, some of the bias towards reproductive health and reproductive rights framing. On the labor side, sort of this perception of labor's traditionally about white men, when in fact the labor movement is much more diverse than often the stereotype. So in both of your movements, there's been a need to establish that the voices of women of color, and specifically Black women, really are central to the conversation, not peripheral.
Absolutely. Black women's intellectual contributions are often left out of the historical retelling of social movements. That is why within the RJ movement, it's so very important that we tell her story of reproductive justice accurately, that Black women coined the term and laid the foundation for the framework, and that collectively women of color expanded the theory. Because when we leave out the contributions, or when we leave out the full story of Black women's contributions to organizing social justice movements, we further this misnomer that Black women lack the ability to create feminist or womanist epistemological knowledge. And it contributes to our invisibilization. We need only look at how the contributions of Black women have been left out of the feminist movement and also out of the civil rights movement. I mean, you hear about Dr. King, you hear about Reverend Abernathy, but how often do we hear about Diane Nash or Ella Baker? How often have we heard the story that the reason that Dr. King talks about the dream is because at the encouraging and prompting of Mahalia Jackson, saying, tell him about the dream, Martin. So it's important that we always tell that story so that we can highlight both the knowledge, the agency, and the ability of Black women to formulate critical analysis.
Wow. If I had known at the beginning of my work about the 1881 Atlanta washerwomen strike, then I would have understood that it has always been a part of the agency and place of women of color to be involved in labor struggles, right? But that wasn't what I saw initially when I joined the labor movement. And so it did take a bit of scholarship and exposure on my own part and the part of the people around me to really begin to find my footing, as Toni talks about. So yeah.
Well, I'm going to do something a little impossible and a little unfair, although, I had warned you ahead, because I'm going to ask each of you if you could give a very brief overview for some audience members who might not be familiar with the movement each of you is a leader in. And to be clear, I would love to hear hours and hours from each of these, but if you could just give a brief overview of some of the core principles of the movement you've been involved in. Toni, I'll start with you. For audience members who aren't familiar with RJ or the reproductive justice framework, could you summarize its pillars? And also, could you talk just a little about how it's different from the reproductive health and the reproductive rights frameworks?
Sure. The real quick explanation. Reproductive justice is grounded in both the human rights framework and Black feminist theory. And it says that every individual has the human right to have a child, to decide not to have a child, to parent the children that one has with the social and economic supports they need so that they and their children can not just survive, but thrive. And the last pillar is the right to bodily autonomy and sexual expression. And we flesh out, of course, those four pillars. What makes reproductive justice different is one, that it is grounded in the lived experiences of the individual. And so when we talk about the differences between reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice, I'm glad you asked that question, because oftentimes people conflate the three. And they're really three separate movements. Reproductive health is about individual service delivery. It is about the provision of healthcare and those associated social services that oftentimes are needed as a part of healthcare. So we're talking about the work that providers do, doctors and clinicians and nurses, so forth and so on. Reproductive rights is about moving public policy, affecting changes in public policies, legal advocacy, and using the US Constitution to accomplish that. Reproductive justice is about movement building and utilizing human rights standards. And it's about trying to prevent the human rights abuses before they occur. And if you think about it this way, it's like three different lenses or three different ways of looking at an approach to securing justice or reproductive and sexual justice for everyone, but they're complementary. And we can't achieve true reproductive freedom without all three. We need the providers who are providing the healthcare. We need the legal folks who are fighting back punitive forms of policies and helping us to figure out what to do now that Roe is overturned. And we need reproductive justice because that's building a movement, organizing and mobilizing a movement of people.
Thank you so much. And one of the things I wanted to pick up on was something you've been such a great teacher for me and for many others, that reproductive justice, it acknowledges the right not to continue pregnancy, but just as importantly, the right to continue pregnancy and raise families, particularly in light of reproductive oppression that poor women and women of color have faced in terms of being able to establish their families.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thanks, Toni. Vonda, I'm going to turn to you now for just a few moments. For audience members who are not familiar with labor unions, could you define what a union is and describe some of the ways that unions build power for their working people, for the working people who are their members and their families?
Sure. I have to say that I was one of those folks. My mother was a school teacher, so she never really talked about what union was. But the short answer is that a union is an organization that you build with your co-workers. And in workplaces across the country, if you are fortunate enough to go into a place where the union is already established, you might not realize like how it was built. And you might also believe that it is about protecting wages, hours, and working conditions. And certainly you've heard if you enjoy a weekend, thank a union. If you have health care, thank a union. And there are a whole laundry list of things, both internal to the workplace and that are part of public policy that the union has been responsible for advocating for. The AFL-CIO represents about 55 different kinds of unions that range from school teachers to manufacturing, come out of auto plants. That's what most folks think about when they think about unions. But we also represent folks in the creative arts, musicians, artists, just a variety of folks that work and drive our economy. In terms of how we are thinking about unions more and more, this idea around bargaining for the common good not just bargaining for wages, hours, and working conditions and what happens inside the workplace, but in a more holistic way, addressing the environment or addressing housing, healthcare, reproductive rights. There's overlap there. I mean, all of those things that impact the life of a worker are all things that the labor movement concerns itself with and works to advocate for both at the local, state, and national level. Our Central Labor Council, of which I'm the president, is the umbrella organization for the Middle Tennessee area, and there are 5 of those in the state of Tennessee. Many states have others. We have 50 state federations. And then, of course, our national body in Washington, D.C. that lobbies and works with Congress, the president, to make sure that the public policy at the national level includes protections for workers. I would say that it's the only organization in the world that constantly advocates for the needs of workers, and 99% of us work for a living. So it's a pretty broad umbrella that labor unions operate under, for sure.
Thank you both. It's such a gift even to just have this quick chance to, for those who aren't familiar with one or the other, to really just jump right in and become more familiar. And we're hoping the whole series becomes a way for people to become more fluent and engaged with both reproductive justice and worker justice together. I'm going to switch the order just slightly because I want to build directly off a point you just made, Vonda, and a connection that I hadn't fully realized. So we often think of reproductive justice often in the sphere of our closest relations, building families and close intimate relations and parenthood. Vonda, you're talking about the workplace and the fact that, nearly all of us have to work and the setting of the workplace. But I'm realizing from your comments, one place of convergence is both RJ and the labor movement also care about healthy communities and the kind of resources people need to build from their families through their broader communities. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little each about, Toni, I'll start with you, but I wonder if you could both talk about how the two movements, how reproductive justice and or labor for you, Vonda, how it seeks to build healthy and safe families and communities for everybody, really.
Certainly. And so you're really talking about that third pillar, right? The social economic conditions that people need to really sustain their family so that they're not just surviving, but thriving. And so there's a difference between surviving and thriving. Thriving means that people and communities are flourishing. Surviving means that someone's basically just existing. And when we talk about that third pillar, we're really talking about, and just to kind of use a present day example, we all hear about, we're in the midst of, inflation, right? As you begin to think about how that plays out for everyday families, the fact that gas is between $4 and $6 a gallon and people getting minimum wage, the income levels have not increased along with the levels of inflation. And so now you have people who are struggling to meet basic life necessities, buy gas so that they can drive to their job, so that they can make money to keep a roof over their head, so they can pay their rent. And then you factor in that the rent across the country, the rental market has went up by 20%, over 20% in some places. So now people are struggling to house their families and potentially becoming unhoused because they don't have the economic means to keep up with the rent increase. So, making those kinds of connections about what does it take to ensure that people have the resources to be able to lead reproductive and sexually healthy lives. And even looking at the environment, the fact that places in this day, that a place like Flint, Michigan, and now Mississippi, people don't have access to clean water. It's a huge human rights abuse. People need water to thrive and to survive, actually. And need water, the fact that they don't have water or clean water means that not only can they not meet their basic day-to-day necessities, but we're talking about putting people's lives at jeopardy because they don't have access to clean water. So reproductive justice calls upon us to look at what are those social economic supports that people need so that they and their families can thrive.
Yeah, and Vonda, I imagine that resonates a lot with sort of unions that you've been part of that are also working for families to be able to thrive and also their whole communities. I mean, you mentioned bargaining for the common good as a way of focusing not just on individual, or not just on the workers themselves, but on their whole communities.
Look, working women make up like 47% of the workforce. And so when you talk about paid leave, when you talk about access to childcare, when you talk about all of the realities around health and safety, around childcare, all of those things, while they may not have been considered like within the initial frame of labor, have now, especially with the COVID pandemic, been placed full circle in the front view of, you know, what are the things that we should be focused on and working on. And in fact, at our most recent convention in on June, which is the policymaking meeting for the next 4 years, there was a resolution passed around promoting gender equity. And promoting gender equity includes reproductive health. It includes making sure that the care economy, that pay begins to meet what Toni was talking about, the increasing costs of just surviving, and trying to move towards having thriving, workers. So yeah, and the fact that, there are so many folks that we began to understand that are uninsured, and how the pandemic showed, the folks that didn't have access to health care. So all of those things became issues that, of course, the labor movement is grappling with, and how best to build more movement partners around those issues.
Keep checking to make sure I'm muted, because the whole time each of you is speaking, I'm just saying the entire time. I just am so grateful for the wisdom you're bringing in. It's really exciting to see and hear in your answers some of those deep connections of shared values, and that to realize in ways that it's not always publicly understood, but to realize these two movements deeply resonate and support each other, and they share a vision of everybody being able to thrive. I love that distinction and that highlighting of thriving. How do we make sure everybody thrives, and thrives in equal ways? I think is clear in what both you're saying, that we thrive, but in ways that there's equality, not that some groups get to thrive and others don't, but really that everybody can thrive equally with each other. Before we should, Vonda, if it's okay, I'll work in a question that came up in the Q&A. Specifically, one of the audience members wondering if in the labor movement, is there support among unions for helping their workers and families access abortion or other reproductive care, particularly in states where it's no longer legal? How's that landing right now in the labor movement?
So, as you know, I mentioned there are 55 different unions that are affiliated under the umbrella of our federation. Of course, the cultures of those unions range from very proactive to those that come along as the trends kind of move in that direction. But I would say that the passage at our convention of the resolutions which supported reproductive health care are an indication that the labor movement on whole is moving in a direction where, in many cases we operate on the collective bargaining agreements are what undergird our movement. And so moving to have those kinds of protections included in our collective bargaining agreements, if not the law, will take some time. But I would say that there is a general consensus that is needed, and to provide protections for workers in states where their reproductive options are being limited.
So you're speaking to hopefully the possibility that the labor movement can then become another front for the reproductive justice work of ensuring people have this kind of access, at least that that's a growth edge for the future.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So if it's okay, I'm going to turn. I know we're getting some good questions, so I'll make sure to keep track of them, and we'll weave in as many as we can throughout. But I want to turn now to a little bit different, still related, but a slightly different focus. And that is around this question of intersectionality. One thing that I know has been central to both of your work is that the intersection of gender and racial justice, and then of course connected to class justice as well, in both RJ and the labor movement, or at least in some really vibrant parts of the labor movement, there is this intentional commitment to gender and racial justice. Actually, Toni, maybe I'll turn to you first. The intersection of racial and gender and class justice, that's definitive for RJ. And I wonder if you could just help our audience members sort of see how RJ really works at that focus of the intersections.
Sure. So examining reproductive and sexual health issues using a reproductive justice approach can really help us kind of advance an understanding of the multidimensional power dynamics in which reproductive issues are embedded. And this lens then helps us to illuminate, for instance, the complexities of reproductive decision-making, because it helps us to untangle some of the underlying social factors, all of which have a complex and intricate connection to gendered relations. So, and these can include access to information, education, or services, or sexual exploitation and violence, or social and economic deprivation, and so forth and so on. And just to give you an example, take for instance, I won't use abortion because I feel like in this moment of Roe, right? This moment of figuring out what to do about Roe, and unfortunately, reproductive justice has become the catch-all phrase when people really mean abortion. But let's take, for example, the issue of access to contraception. It can simultaneously be a tool for promoting some people's empowerment, and also a source of oppression for others through this kind of what we call this contraception paradox, if you will. There's this underlying assumption that inherent in the field of sometimes reproductive health and rights, that contraceptive autonomy, if you can just remove the obstructions and prevent interference with people being able to make decisions, that you can resolve the contraception problem. If you can just give people surefire method, long-acting reversible method of contraception that will cure, that will, that's our cure for unintended pregnancy. But to assume that autonomy can be assured simply by preventing interference and removing barriers to free informed choice is a misnomer, because you don't factor in the multi-dimensional power dynamics that's associated with the ways in which people have to make decisions. So what I mean by that is, we think that when we give people, for instance, long-acting reversible methods of contraception, we've resolved the unintended pregnancy issue. But we have not resolved the issue of risk of HIV and other sexually transmitted infections, because we know that most people don't dual contracept, meaning that if you use a hormonal-based method of contraception, more than likely you're not going to use a barrier method of contraception. And so we haven't really addressed the complexity of people's lives. When we talk about comprehensive, for instance, sexuality education, we don't consider the fact that most folks aren't born having a deep understanding of basic reproductive autonomy and reproductive health. And so we've missed that part about educating people not just about the anatomy, but the sacredness of their bodies, this gift that God gave us, and that we are in charge of this gift that we have received, the gift of this body, the gift of our sexuality, of our sacred sexuality. And so when we take the approach of autonomy and preventing interference, it's really a rights-based approach. But what we know is that a rights-based approach pretends that people have access to a marketplace of options that they don't have access to. And typically that is along the lines of gender and race and class. Hope that explains.
Oh, beautifully. Thank you so much. And one connection to labor too, as you're just describing, is that a lot of labor law for a long time was built on this assumption that workers and their employers are both on an equal playing field negotiating their contract, right? Where, an employer can negotiate for what they want and make a choice about whether to work for that person. And Toni, what you're bringing out that's important in both the RJ side and the labor side is, what are the various factors that shape the kind of choices people have to even make in the first place? I mean, is that a fair way to put it? Sorry. Yeah. And I think in both the reproductive world and the labor world, the idea of choice is never enough. It's about the conditions for making those choices, whether it's in terms of reproductive choices and life making or community making, or in the labor side of how do people shape the workplace and what they want to be happening in the workplace. Vonda, feel free, go ahead and jump in. Yeah.
So, I was sitting here thinking as Toni was talking about how I wish that I met her and had the lesson that she just taught in the last 5 minutes, like 20 years ago, when I was negotiating benefits for 10,000 Bridgestone Firestone workers. And we just did not have the language to even know what to ask for in terms of proposals. And on either side, I just don't think that there was a fully formed understanding of the complexities, particularly in people's reproductive lives. And here I was sitting at a table at 30 years old, all male on both sides of the table. And my language and understanding at that point was limited. What I did know was that access to contraception was important and should be a part of the benefit offerings of our health insurance. But beyond that, having a more holistic approach to like negotiations, and this is, full disclosure. But I don't feel like some of the information that I was able to bring to the table as a woman in that space was even education for the other folks that sat around the table, both on the company side and the union side. And so I just think that, a lot of this is shrouded in, particularly around reproductive health, is not something that we have open dialogue and education about. And so that's why I just feel fortunate to have now been in, so that I have a resource to be able to go to fully inform going forward how we educate our folks that are going to negotiate this aspect of people's lives.
Sure. And likewise, Vonda, I know that even in the reproductive justice movement, there's still some pieces that we still need to grab hold of. I remember when I worked at the Chicago Abortion Fund, one of the first questions we would ask someone was, how much money have you been able to raise? And then we'd say, have you exhausted all of your resources? So can you pick up some additional work? Can you do some hair braiding? Can you borrow money from friends or family? Can you sell or pawn something? And talking to one of the callers one day, I realized that we needed to stop asking people to sell or pawn their possessions, right? That one, asking someone to pawn something could put them further in debt trying to buy it out of the pawn shop. And so there are still, I think, lessons for us to learn, things for us to think about, things that we need to help us continue to expand our lens to see the more subtle ways that reproductive and sexual agency gets restricted for individuals and for whom.
Well, and if I may, one of the things that's exciting about this whole series is it's a chance for us to think about both the reproductive realm and the workplace as places where we're trying to create more agency for individuals, but also for communities working for more equity, and how we can see that there are so many parallels and ways that the two movements can really support each other because of that shared commitment to healthy and thriving communities and on a basis of equity for everybody in the community. Before we switch topics, Vonda, I wonder if you'd be willing to just say just a little bit more about how the importance of shifting our perspective from labor and worker movements as being only about industrial white men to the present day workforce, in which women overall and women of color specifically are central and essential, as the pandemic has proved. So the ways that women workers, and we should say women and gender expansive workers, as well as specifically women of color and gender expansive people of color, are central to the labor movement, despite preconception or stereotypes that nope, labor is just about old white dudes.
Well, the workforce has changed, right? And because the workforce has changed, with all of the jobs that we now consider precarious employment, it's a shame, but it's a reality that full-time sustainable work, family sustaining work that provides benefits to live out the full accoutrement of what constitutes a thriving, happy life. That is full center. Before the pandemic, 51% of the workforce was female. Many women have come out of the workforce as a result of childcare, parent care responsibilities. But as we look at the future of the workforce, it is Black and brown, and it is female. And if the labor movement is to grow, then the things and concerns of have to be high priority in terms of the labor movement and the priorities that it seeks for all workers. And it's interesting when we talk about reproductive health, we talk about it from a frame that it's only important to women, when that's definitely not the case. We in our health and safety work, lead in some industrial workplaces is something that, if exposure to that during pregnancy, it can endanger children. But the reality is that it wasn't just women that were exposed to lead, but men as well. And so it was the reproductive capacity of everyone that was impacted by the high levels of lead. So sometimes I think that we narrow the scope of our discussion around reproductive health and reproductive justice to just women, when it impacts entire families and whatever, regardless of gender.
Absolutely, yeah. And I just want to highlight, and if we end up talking about this for a while, that's okay too, but the notion of care and the issue of care is another interesting connection. I mean, Vonda, you talked about the pressures that workers are under in order to provide care for their families, both in terms of children, but also elderly parents too. And I know, from the reproductive justice side, that's long been a concern as well. How do people have what they need to care? And so I think that's another point of connection of the care that our society depends on. How do we ensure that it is resourced adequately, and that it's equitable, and that it promotes thriving communities? So one of the things that I think is, it's more obvious in some ways on the labor side, but I also think it's still central on the reproductive justice side, is challenging corporate power and the ways that corporations, in the pursuit of profit, are often oppressing their employees, the environments that they're connected to, but also oppressing families, both directly and indirectly. So I'll turn to you, Toni, but I'm wondering if you could both talk about the ways that your movement challenges the power of corporations to keep oppressing, to maintain systems of oppression. Vonda, do you want to chime in first about sort of the labor movement challenging the power of corporations?
Sure. In this moment, I think that all freedoms, whether it relates to voting rights or reproductive rights, or are under attack. And the folks that are undergirding that, the money that is undergirding that, is capitalist corporate money. Now, the way that shows up, whether you are a rank and file worker, or whether you are a grievance person that handles grievances, or whether you negotiate contracts, or whether you are working to advocate for policy, may be different. But the reality is that the money that undergirds all of the attacks on freedoms that we are currently experiencing comes from capitalists. And so, you know, the fight for voting rights and the fight for economic justice and the fight for reproductive justice, all of those have a common person that we are, a people that we are working against, for sure.
So Toni, I'm curious how you see it from the RJ perspective. What are the ways, some of the ways that corporations are also involved in reproductive oppression, and how does RJ challenge that?
Sure. One, I think, very good example is through religious hospitals, religious institutions that deny women and pregnant capable people vital reproductive health services because of their, and if we take the Catholic Church, oftentimes the directives from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops that they don't offer abortions, that abortion is a part of miscarriage management, that contraception, even the provision of contraception sometimes will come under question. The problem isn't just that those services aren't provided. The problem is that the communities where these institutions are situated have no knowledge that those services are not being provided or not available. And so folks in the community go to, for instance, the nearest hospital, thinking that they can get the healthcare that they need. And oftentimes to find out that, yes, you can get certain forms of healthcare, but certain kinds of reproductive healthcare, you're not going to be able to get. You won't be able to get a tubal ligation. You may not be able to get help with assisted reproductive technologies and infertility treatments. And so that becomes a huge issue because many Catholic institutions are housed in communities that are heavily populated by Black, Indigenous people of color. And so there's this tension, right? On the one hand, this medical institution is providing general health care to save people's lives. But then on the other hand, when it comes to healthcare or reproductive and sexual healthcare, those services just aren't available. And so where are people supposed to go in the community? So it becomes a huge issue. One, some groups are trying to take some very unique steps, and you know, do we start telling the communities where these hospitals are situated that this institution doesn't provide certain reproductive and sexual health services? But that still doesn't address the issue, because if that's the nearest medical facility in your community, where else will you go? And so this is becoming a huge problem, not just in urban areas, but also in rural communities as well. So that's one way when I think about corporations. And then if you recall, during the passage or attempting to get the Affordable Care Act passed, if you recall, Hobby Lobby saying that they were not going to make contraception available to their employees and denying a certain segment of their workforce access to critical healthcare services just because of their gender.
Toni, I also wonder, to expand on what you're saying, or something your comment makes me think about, is the then broader issue of community investment and the ways that corporations in general, and then particularly financial institutions, exercise a lot of power over where they invest in communities and where they de-invest in communities. But then, of course, that's a labor issue as well, right? In terms of where corporations are directing resources and trying to help communities thrive, but also where they're de-investing from communities and really damaging communities too.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I want to, if it's okay, I want to turn, we've got several questions in the Q&A that I want to make some time for. So we will end our session day on the question about new exciting organizing and activism. Just in case we all need some good news and cheering up at the end, we'll save that to the very end, some new exciting organizing and activism. But one of the questions that came up that I'd like to pitch to both of you, and then there's one or two to each of you, but one that came up from Maggie Kamitska, who will be moderating a later session. But this question is, Maggie's question is, can each of you speak to how your engagement with religion or the church has helped and or hindered, and I appreciate the inclusion of both, helped and or hindered your social justice work?
Well, I'm happy to go first. It certainly has been, in the health rights and justice movement, it has been a challenge because abortion is such I mean, it stirs up visceral emotions in people. And, honestly, the church has not been as supportive. However, there have been supportive clergy. I mean, we need only look at the clergy consultation service that came together before Roe, of Protestant clergy and rabbis working together to not only refer women for abortion care, but also actively helping them get to the places where they could receive abortion care. So we know that there is a history of concerned clergy who have been very supportive, but not the church overall, right? As an institution, it has not been supportive of the reproductive health rights and justice movements. I should say certain denominations, I mean, certainly the Universal Unitarians have been very supportive of issues of reproductive health rights and justice. But I can't say so for some of the other denominations. Wish I could.
So I know of a womanist theologian and ethicist who's trying to change those traditions, and we're lucky to be in her presence right now.
Thank you.
So grateful for your work in that. I mean, that's been part of an important part of your work, is saying, although, as you just point out, Christian traditions have often not been helpful, your work helps us see actually there are resources in Christian tradition that can challenge those assumptions.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we can draw from the scripture, we can draw from our lived experiences, we can draw from our traditions. And so we know not only the history of concerned clergy, but we have examples that we can go to in the Christian text that talk about our free will and our free will to be able to make decisions about our lives. And we can go to the places in the text that talk about sacred sexuality, but it oftentimes requires that we interrogate even those texts that talk about subjugating women, subjugating those who are different. And it really calls for us to draw upon what it means to be in that process of Christian witness, to care for the least of God's people.
Absolutely. Vonda, how about you? Where do you see, or how has religion and the church been help or hindrance for your work in social justice?
Well, as I was listening to Toni answer that question, again, it was helpful to draw the parallels between our movements. The labor movement, particularly in the South where I'm situated, has not always enjoyed the support of the faith community. Thank goodness for programs like Winland Cook. Thank goodness for, there are always exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, the social teachings of the church have been that relate to work and the dignity of work, have been largely not engaged. I wouldn't say that it was hostile, but I would say that they were not engaged in ways that could be transformative for both. I mean, I feel like that labor work is faith work, and feel like that the intersections there are tremendous. But I feel like that there is a political space that has placed barriers between the ability of labor communities and faith communities to work together in the kinds of partnerships that could be transformative for union members who are in many cases members and support the faith institutions that don't speak up on labor issues. So when we look at the examples of the movements of the 60s with Dr. King, it was the labor movement that was a large supporter and funder of that work. But those relationships have not been as enduring as they could and should be. So, yeah.
Part of what I'm hearing from each of you is that for both reproductive justice and labor, religion offers possibilities for the future that can hopefully religious communities can be doing more and be actually in more meaningful solidarity than they have been, which is both a frustration of some of the lack of support in the past, but also creates the space for possibility going forward, I think. And I hope that the audience for these webinars over time, not just I hope, I suspect the kind of folks who are going to be coming to these webinars are some of the people trying to advance that work in religious communities. And hopefully we're creating more of that conversation as well. Yeah. Toni, I'm going to shift to you for another question from the Q&A, and then Vonda, I'm going to I'll pitch one to you in just a second as well. To you, Toni, and I'm going to phrase this slightly differently from how it came up in the Q&A, only just drawing upon some other knowledge in RJ theory. But the question really is wanting to look at the difference and your nuances around using human rights language versus the fact that in the reproductive rights world, there's a reliance on the US constitutional framework of rights. So could you talk about why in RJ, the human rights framework, the international human rights framework has been a better resource for the movement than the US Constitution, the framework of US constitutional rights?
Sure. The reason why we utilize the human rights or decided to utilize the human rights framework is because it gave us a way to, one, talk about not just the protection of human rights, but to also educate people about their human rights. And also to talk about what is that standard? What are the values and principles that should inform how people's human right to lead reproductive and sexually healthy lives? What should that standard look like? What should be the values and principles that inform them? And at the same time, what is the obligation of the broader community to report those human rights violations? The reproductive rights framework is guided by certainly the legal standards, but oftentimes does not take in the lived experiences of the people from the communities, and enables those folks who are in the community to lead the work of the movement. So in the reproductive rights movement, we have the attorneys and the legal, which is all good. We need that. We need folks going into the courts and arguing, on behalf of reproductive rights. But the average everyday person can't go in the courtroom like that lawyer and argue for their right to be able to access reproductive and sexual health care. But utilizing the human rights framework, they can. And it also enables us to bring in that intersectional analysis. It enables us to talk about that multidimensional power dynamics, right, of race, of class, of gender, and to talk about how all of those together create this perfect storm of human rights abuses. When I said that the use of the word choice implies that people have access to a marketplace of options, when we use the word of choice, it says that people have the ability, the resources, the access, the information to even be able to make a choice. Reproductive justice enables us to see, as I said earlier, to see the multidimensional dynamics that preclude people from even being able to make a choice. And to gain a deeper understanding, to lift the layers back of why people, the conditions that people live under that preclude them from being able to make a choice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So part of what I'm hearing, and I want to make sure I'm hearing accurately, but part of what I'm hearing you pointing out is that how the international human rights framework works as a legal movement is distinct from how the rights-based approach in the US works. And frankly, that the human rights movement, international human rights movement, is more grounded in on-the-ground lived experiences of people, and the importance of that in the way that at least certain corners of the US legal movement tend to be have at times been less grounded in lived experiences.
Absolutely. And now, if I was going to lift up a challenge to reproductive justice in the human rights framework, I would say that the one piece we still have to figure out is how do we hold the US accountable to standards documented in international human rights treaties and conventions that they've never signed on to.
Well, and ironically, historically, the US often used its both military and soft power to push other nations to standards that the US has not lived up to, which we can also talk about the way that applies on labor as well in just a moment. But, and also I just want to, before we move to a different topic, and if I understand correctly, part of the issue as well that the RJ movement raises is the US constitutional framework, the right at the center of the reproductive rights framework is the right to privacy.
Right.
Which
RJ went out the window with Roe, right? Because they were too, saying that there is no right to privacy, if you will. And so with the RJ framework, we are saying absolutely there's a right to privacy, just as there is a right which is connected to autonomy, right? And yeah, so huge difference in that respect.
Is it fair to say though that one of the differences for when RJ talks about autonomy is it's not about, so privacy is about the individual removed in some ways from a broader social context. Autonomy is about the individual in a broader community context, at least in terms of how RJ thinks of it. autonomy for
Yeah.
RJ is always about the individual in a community. Is that fair?
Yes, I would say both and.
Okay,
Because
okay,
the
yeah.
other thing to keep in mind is just as we fight for people to have the autonomy to make decisions about their bodies, we may not always agree with the decisions that people make. But if we are truly fighting for people to have autonomy, we don't get to control the kinds of decisions that they make. Autonomy means that we support you making a decision, right? Whether we think it's a good decision or a bad decision, we support an individual's human right to be able to make autonomous decisions and trust that people, and I think the other piece that we're saying is that we trust that people have the human capability to be able to make decisions, moral decisions, to engage in moral decision making about their reproductive and sexual lives.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. If it's okay, we'll switch to Vonda for a second for another question that came up in the Q&A. Excuse me, I hit mute, excuse me. But Vonda, could you talk about how faith and the broader community can come together to build power at the bargaining table, and particularly think of the example of care workers, because care workers, as Suzanne, the question asker, points out, care workers are at the intersection of advocating for themselves and their coworkers as workers, but also advocating for the people they care for. And that creates additional layers of challenge there.
So that is an intersection in terms of negotiating contracts for care workers and public sector workers, where those contracts become moral documents. And we have found in those particular negotiation processes that there is an ability for faith communities to understand, evaluate, and support what it is that care workers need. Many of them are their parishioners, right? And so most recently, we've had contract negotiations with the National Nurses Association, where faith partners have come to the table with the National Nurses Association because they have more of a community kind of a negotiation model that is not just a few folks from the union and a few folks from the company trying to negotiate a contract. They seem to be bringing in more folks from the community as stakeholders and voices at the table. And so teachers are another space where we're seeing educators, where we're seeing the community and the faith community as a part of that, being a part of negotiation processes to really negotiate more moral documents. Because in reality, you know, what we pass in a public space that impacts our tax dollars, it is a moral space, and those are moral documents. And we find that we've had the most success in terms of the relationships that faith community and labor, you know, advocates have been able to work in partnership in the care economy.
I'm also thinking, Vonda, of the ways that care is such a central value of religious communities. And because of that, it creates a possible partnership to think about, to borrow a phrase, but like, what is the continuum of care? Both unions of care workers and religious communities are caring for their communities in ways that are essential to their communities to survive. And that's it's both a conceptual sort of a shared idea or shared value, but it's also just on the ground how care is provided. Religious communities and care workers who are unionizing, they're the front lines together.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And so in those cases, I think especially as we move forward, I don't know that I agree with the president that we are post-pandemic, but as we move beyond this period, I think that the partnerships that will emerge will be more holistic and incorporate larger parts of both communities.
Thank you. So in a second, I'm going to ask both of you to talk a little bit more about some new organizing and forms of activism that are giving you hope and energy. Before then, though, Toni, if we could, we had another question that came up in the Q&A was about the role of medical abortions and the increasing number of medical abortions, how that's affecting the need for funding and also getting information out about medical abortion.
Sure. So absolutely, we have seen greater activism around trying to make medical abortion available to people. But again, I always say medical abortion is not going to be our silver bullet. We're not going to work our way out of this through medical abortion because medical abortion is done in the first trimester. And it means that people will need to know that they are pregnant in the first trimester. We also have to factor in the 6-week abortion ban in some states. And not a whole bunch of people know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. So, again, this is where we need to look to expand our reproductive health education, because it's a lot more than just, people can get a medical abortion. We will always need surgical abortions because there will always be a group of folks who won't know that they're pregnant in their first trimester, or they might be trying to raise money to get an abortion in a whole nother state and can't raise the money and transition to a period where they can no longer get a medical abortion. So we'll always need medical abortions. We'll always need surgical abortions.
Sorry, something that just came to mind that I just have to comment on that is another interesting connection between RJ and the labor movement is that geography and divide and conquer tactics play such a huge role in obstructing in both. So on the RJ side, as you're pointing to, Toni, the fact that each state has its own laws and state borders can become such a source of inequality. Vonda, I'm thinking on the labor side of how the fact that unionizing has to happen workplace by workplace, and also the boundaries around, corporations dividing their workers geographically and by unit becomes a bar. So in both of these units, part of the challenge is how do we create wider and wider networks of solidarity when there's kind of inherent challenges dividing people from being able to work together.
You know what, Jeremy, just today we were, I was in a meeting where they were building out a map of states where reproductive laws had already been put in place versus right to work states and places where the minimum wage had not been raised. All of those layers are really intersections where we should begin to work together, because those are the places where all rights are being challenged, and I think provide a basis for the kind of work to be able to build a foundation of expanded justice work going forward and solidarity work going forward.
It's almost as if there are forces that don't want poor and working class people to have options in their personal lives or in the workplace, almost as if it's this coordinated effort or something. Of course, yeah. Well, To end, as we're nearing our the end of our time, I want to end on a note of hope and possibilities. So I'm wondering if you could each just say a little bit about some of the kinds of new organizing or new activism that are giving you energy or that you want to just draw attention to. Toni, do you mind starting us off, and then Vonda?
Sure. So one group, Spiritual Alliance for Communities for Reproductive Dignity, working with community organizers and religious leaders and they've created this curriculum to help congregations to embrace reproductive dignity. So creating these congregations of reproductive dignity, utilizing a reproductive justice lens. And then of course, Interfaith Voices for Reproductive Justice that is working with the religious scholars to highlight and bridge kind of like the work with religious communities, secular advocacy communities, and the Religious Academy to talk about reproductive and sexual justice. So those two groups give me hope.
Mm-hmm. So you said Sacred Dignity and then Interfaith Voices for Reproductive Justice.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you. Vonda, how about you? What's some new organizing that's giving you some good energy these days?
Well, I tell you, these days, it hasn't always in my work life, but these days it's a good day to be a union member. The last Gallup poll said that 68% of Americans, if they had the opportunity, would join a union, and 77% of young people are supportive of unions. And so the organizing that we are seeing in the Starbucks and Amazons and those kinds of places is really the new and different and untraditional organizing that's happening there really gives me hope. And not only that, but the partnerships that are emerging in the most unlikely of places. Just like this conversation today, the overlaps and the opportunities for partnership provide me a sense of hope that, to be honest, I hadn't had in many years. So, yeah.
Well, I'm going to thank you both in just a moment, but as we're coming to the end of our time here, I want to say to all of our audience, while there is much work to be done, we can do it all together if we're working in solidarity. And that's the hope of this whole series. Our next webinar, again, the next four are all in the same time slot, Mondays at 5 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central. The next one coming up, so next Monday, the topic is solidarity between reproductive. Oh, I believe I just mistook that. I'm realizing I may have mistaken that, excuse me. But the entire series is at www.religionandjustice.org/events, www.religionandjustice.org/events. And I want to correct myself. The next coming one, October 3rd, Monday, next Monday, is on faith-based activism. So as Toni had mentioned, there have always been some clergy, at least, who are the real partners for this work. And so faith-based activism will bring some of those folks to the table. And then we'll look at solidarity between these two movements later after that. So lots of exciting topics coming up over the next month. We want to invite you to check out the websites of the partner organizations that have sponsored this, as well as Wendland Cook's program. Again, at www.religionandjustice.org, there's also a blog series that accompanies these webinars, several different exciting installments there. And also you can sign up for the Wendland Cook program's email list to find out about future programs, and also like on Facebook. We want to thank all of the partners who've made this possible, and just a quick shout out one more time to In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive justice agenda, the Central Labor Council of Nashville and Middle Tennessee, Union Theological Seminary in New York, Drew Theological Seminary at Drew University, and the Carpenter Program in Religion, Gender, and Sexuality at Vanderbilt. I especially, of course, want to conclude thanking Toni and Vonda. You have been, as always, inspiring, and it has been such a privilege to hear you in conversation. You give all of us hope, and we're so grateful for all that you've done to keep these movements moving forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a delight to be here.
Thank you.
And to everyone else, have a wonderful night and keep on keeping on.